This presentation discusses the purposes for using outside sources in your paper. You can move through this presentation at your own pace. Click Continue when you are ready to move to the next slide. Like this student here, sometimes I feel overwhelmed by the sources I find. I might spend hours looking through books or articles or websites and find a lot of great information, but what do I do with it afterwards? You might wonder who is in charge of their research paper. Are your sources in charge? If so, you'll end up with a disconnected paper. You may have great quotes and evidence, but there won't be a purpose or connection between them. Or you, as a writer, might just disappear from under all the outside sources within the paper. So how do you gain control of your research? First, start with a clear thesis and section thesis statements. Identify what you are trying to prove. Then use your sources to test your claims. Does your research contradict your claims? If so, consider why they disagree with you. This doesn't mean that you should start over. Get excited if people disagree with you. This means your research is necessary. But evaluate their arguments and evidence and look for your own evidence to disprove what you have found in other research. You may need to adjust your thesis based on what you found or adapt some of your sections, but consider how what they have to say can actually validate your own claims. Once you've tested your claims, you'll start gathering information to support those claims. As the craft of research explains, you'll use reasons and evidence to support these claims. Your sources will provide some of your reasons and your evidence. The literature you analyze might also provide evidence as well. As you incorporate outside sources into your paper, make sure each quote, paraphrase, or summary has a specific purpose. Here are some purposes for using an outside source. I'll illustrate these purposes with several examples in the next slides. As you look at these examples, pay attention to other things as well. How do these writers develop credibility for their sources? How do they move between their ideas, the source quotes, and then the literature that they're analyzing? How do they use MLA, etc.? And consider these as models as well. One purpose for a source is to establish the criteria you will use in your paper. For example, you might want to prove that a character is relatable. But what criteria will you use? That the character is good looking? That the character is funny? And how can you convince your reader that these are good criteria for analysis? A source can effectively provide the criteria for your analysis. Look at the example here. In The Resisting Reader, A Feminist Approach to American Fiction, Judith Federle discusses the use of women's stereotypes in American literature. She argues that two types, lady and prostitute, are created by patriarchal constructs for the manipulation of women. Nella Larsen's short story Quicksand establishes these two conventions as she presents the story of Helga Crane, a young mulatto who finds herself striving for self-definition outside the boundaries of these two stereotypes. The criteria, lady and prostitute, come from this respected theorist. Now the writer will simply prove how the character in the story fits these criteria. Here's another example of using a source to establish the criteria for your analysis. Of all of the purposes for using a source, establishing criteria for analysis is one of the most common, particularly when writing literary analyses. In this paragraph, the criteria establish what this writer will prove in her paper. Just as storytelling, or lack thereof, can withdraw an individual from the community, it can also be seen as necessary for reintegration into community. Their Eyes Were Watching God begins and ends on a house porch, with listeners eager for Janie's story, her payment for re-entering society, at the beginning of the novel, and then the paragraph continues. Can you identify the criterion for analysis? Okay, the quotation marks probably give it away, but storytelling as reintegration into the society, that was the criteria. And then the writer just shows how storytelling fulfills this function in the novel. Another purpose for your sources might be to support your claims and conclusions. Look at the following paragraph. As I read, consider how this source supports the opening claim of the paragraph. If storytelling is to serve the measure of an individual, then the individual must be the one to tell his or her story. As theorist Mikhail Bakhtin explains, in a human being there is always something that only he himself can reveal in a free act of self-consciousness and discourse, something that does not submit to an externalizing second-hand definition. This need for self-conscious revelation can be seen by comparing Eula's story from Faulkner's The Hamlet and Janie's story in Their Eyes Were Watching God. Eula never speaks or reveals her story. Although an entire section of this work is devoted to telling Eula's story, the reader only receives stories about her, a second-hand definition. And then the paragraph continues. Bakhtin's view supports the writer's view. This in turn makes the analysis of the two literary texts more significant. You might use a source to provide the problem your paper will address. In this example, the writer shows contradictory opinions about this topic, setting up the need for our argument. Would the real Mary Oliver just stand up? Some critics, such as Janet McNew, categorize Oliver with the other contemporary feminist writers who transvalue their romantic forefathers' mythic assessments of women as they defy the doom of muteness placed on all the female others who inhabit masculine poetic landscapes. Yet other critics dismiss Oliver's work as feminist because it seems to embrace a link between women and nature, viewing such work as regressive or complicit with normative male versions of the female. Oliver herself dislikes classifying her work as feminist. I simply don't consciously write as a woman. It can happen, but to write from that perspective doesn't seem deep enough to me. Despite the debate and Oliver's dismissal, I can look at Oliver's poetry through a feminist lens because as the reader I am fulfilling Oliver's wish that the reader fit the persona of the poem, which for me is a feminist persona. This writer is setting up a reader-oriented response to Oliver's poetry and showing why this response transcends classification of Oliver as a feminist writer or not as a feminist writer. You might also use your sources to provide facts or examples that prove your claims and reasons, or to illustrate your ideas. In this essay, the writer uses a source to provide an opinion supporting the claim, but then proves that opinion by giving an example which happens to come from another source, so you may pair sources together within one paragraph. Traditionally, narrative analysis has been narrowed, at least partially, to two elements, structure and consequence. Of these two elements, structure has dominated narrative analysis until just recently. For example, Labov and Waletsky, who are considered foundational theorists in the field of narrative analysis, focus on a story's temporal sequence. Therefore, stories were only considered narratives if they had a beginning, a middle, and an end, as told in chronological order. Now, while you can pair sources in one paragraph, do be careful that you, the writer, are still present in each paragraph. In this example, the writer does get a little bit lost because every sentence seems to be coming from an outside source. As you begin drafting and continue with your research, be sure to have a reason for including every quote, paraphrase, and summary. These sources will provide some of the reasons and evidence for your argument, but make sure you narrow the purpose behind each source. Are you defining terms, establishing criteria, providing expert opinion that support your claims, proving a problem exists, or providing examples to support your claims? Vary your purposes and vary your sources as you develop your paper, and your paper will be more coherent and better establish the claims that you are proving.